Hi, everyone. I have to admit, I really did not want to have to cover this, but I knew it had to happen. So here goes. I suspect that many people believe this latest UAP Senate congressional hearing for the progress of AARO, that is the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that's AARO, that's that most people would probably not have a lot of confidence in it to begin with. Let's face it, the United States government has never had a good track record of honesty on this subject. And up to and including last year's version of the UAP task force that featured two reps from the Department of Defense, Ronald Moultrie and Scott Bray, pictured here. This year's hearing was chaired by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and this was for the questioning of the head of AARO, that is this gentleman here, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who, by the way, struck me as a clearly very intelligent man with a career history in the Department of Defense. I had a sinking feeling that this was just going to be bad. But I have to say, it exceeded expectations. Like those job reviews you get from the HR department, exceeds expectations, except this one was not in a good way. This was worse than I thought it would be, and that took some doing. So the first thing to understand about this event, and really the first thing to understand about the whole new era of UAP that we are in, really the era since 2017, is that this is what UFOs have become. It's the new branding process of UFOs now seems almost complete, at least from a government and establishment point of view. It's UFOs without the history. That's really what we are looking at. This is the we don't know what is out there, but we are going to investigate and get back to you when we have some answers version of UFOs. So this was a very small hearing, at least insofar as the room looked almost empty to me. Maybe 20 people in there, I don't know. And right off the bat, even before they give the floor to Dr. Kirkpatrick, you hear statements from people like this individual, Senator Judy Ernst, who's talking about Chinese balloons and the ongoing threat of new technologies from America's adversaries. So right away, we see this. Was it overt? Was it sly? Was it both? This attempt to pin blame of UFOs on Russians and Chinese. And you see it going right on. And I'll just point out, historically, it wasn't ever this bad, even during the 1950s Cold War era, when people thought things were pretty bad back then. Back in the 1950s, essentially no one was openly accusing the Soviets or the Russians of inventing flying saucers and invading the United States with their flying saucers. No one was doing this publicly. There were some private classified conversations, and there were some classified analyses of that possibility at the time. That's absolutely true. There were people wondering, did the Russians invent these things? But these conversations never went anywhere, because back then, those analysts seemed to be concerned about evidence. And there just wasn't evidence that the Russians had invented anything like this. And of course, the Chinese weren't even part of the conversation back then. Now, in this hearing, it's not that anyone overtly accused the Russians or Chinese for being behind these newfangled UAP that suddenly seemed to be all over American airspace. But that is clearly what was implied throughout. And it was clearly what was desired by a number of members, such as Senator Ernst, who really seemed to have it in for pinning all of this on them. We have to remember that even the most truly unhinged empire-building, military-industrial complex-friendly senators have to have enough decorum not to overtly accuse the Russians and Chinese of engaging in being behind these UAP. Because if they were to do that, if they were to be explicit about this, that's to say, we know the Russians are behind this, or the Chinese, if they were to be that explicit, it would certainly provoke howls of laughter from probably every single government and diplomatic corps outside the Western bloc of nations. So they're not going to go there because it's not credible. And I don't think anyone really would believe it. You would have to provide some seriously powerful proof. And by the way, it would also be a very escalatory diplomatic thing to say something like that. Not that the United States has anything like diplomacy anymore, but nonetheless, this would be a very dangerous step. And even these people don't seem to be willing yet to go there. And I consider these types of directions to be somewhat unhinged because when you look at the details of the long history of UFO encounters by the United States military, you know that it could not possibly have been the Russians or, of course, the Chinese for nearly all of that time. In the last 10 years, it is possible that we can start looking at this a little differently, maybe, because technology is changing. But certainly up to 2010, 2015, there's not a chance that any of those UAP over U.S. airspace would be Russian or Chinese for a whole bunch of reasons. So even before Dr. Kirkpatrick began to speak, you could see where this whole thing was going. Debunk and demystify UFOs. And indeed, turn UFOs into UAP and make them entirely explainable as conventional technology, even if they are advanced technology from foreign adversaries. So I think it's really where you could see this was going right from the beginning. Dr. Kirkpatrick gave testimony on behalf then of the AARO program, stating like what it was trying to do, essentially gathering together potential UFO or UAP reports from defense personnel to understand just what these things might be. That's essentially what he was saying. He immediately stated that this is not the case of AARO going through the history of UFO reports to resolve them all, or really any of them. I think he made that very clear. He said they were, however, trying to resolve such encounters by Navy and Air Force pilots. And this is one thing that Kirkpatrick said, which was, we cannot answer decades of UAP questions all at once. I assume by which he meant really ever. We're never going to try to answer them. I really do think that was what he was implying. He said, look, we'd like to answer all these UAP questions right away, but first we have to ensure the safety of all DoD personnel. And he said that, and he literally said that, and I thought, how does this make sense? He then tried to explain it. He's like, we have to protect sources and methods, and we have to protect intelligence gathering capabilities. And I suppose by that he meant protecting the safety of personnel. He gave a lot of other platitude, bureaucratic language. AARO is partnering basically with seemingly all of the many branches within the Department of Defense, the intelligence community also, and apparently civilian partners within science and academia, or at least that's the goal. And he really was downplaying his office's ability to resolve this issue of UFOs or UAP. In fact, I would say that he wasn't even willing to acknowledge that there is a UFO mystery. I think he really was actually saying that there's not a mystery here. He said only a very small percentage of UAP sightings are truly anomalous. We've known that forever. That's nothing new. It's those unknowns that we have to wonder about. He stated that most of these have characteristics of balloons, unmanned aerial systems, clutter, natural phenomena, or other readily explainable sources. He goes on, just said anything that's really unexplained is usually due to lack of data. It's the kind of stuff we were hearing in the 1950s from the U.S. Air Force. Project Blue Book said the exact same thing. He brushed aside any conclusions that UAP are in fact extraordinary. He really made a very big push toward that. This is not an extraordinary phenomena. They're advanced, they're interesting, but they're not extraterrestrial. He said, even if they turn out to be quadcopters, he said, that's still a matter of national security. And so a lot of these are rhetorical devices. There was even a lot of talk about the Chinese balloon as a UAP. This was a very big motif of the whole public hearing. I'll just add, to my knowledge, you can correct me if I'm wrong, put it in the comment below if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, no one has made this a definitive conclusion that that was a spy balloon. Probably was. I'm not saying it wasn't. it's not an outrageous conclusion to come to, but I am not aware of any definitive statement to that effect. And I actually do recall hearing unofficial comments from within the U.S. establishment indicating otherwise. Not saying it was or wasn't, but during this hearing, it was essentially a given that that was a spy balloon. I would like to know what the definitive conclusion of that was. That's all I'm saying. They spent a lot of time, though, focusing on UAP as these types of spy balloons and other types of balloons and stuff. And another thing that Kirkpatrick said, and this is explicitly about ET, the whole ET issue. He says, AARO has found no credible evidence thus far of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics. And then he just went on and said, and if we do find such evidence, this is more bureaucratic platitudes, but it's interesting. He said that we are committed to working with our interagency partners at NASA, he said, to appropriately inform the U.S. government's leadership of its findings. So that was interesting. So that means, as I'm reading it, if the AARO program really did come to an ET conclusion, which I'm sure they are never going to come to an ET conclusion, but if they were to, does this mean that they would work with NASA to jointly inform the president of extraterrestrials in the event that they come to that conclusion? That did seem to be what he was saying. And I just wondered, when did NASA rate that high? Are they actually that significant in this whole picture? But he seemed to indicate that they were. I just wondered, why can't AARO do their own briefing and their own reporting? Kirkpatrick said a few other interesting things. Essentially, if you don't like our message, he said, hey, write your own peer-reviewed scientific paper. Science does not work by blog or social media. I think that was definitely a dig at the independent UFO research community. I think that was quite evident. He also said this, which I think was very interesting rhetorical device. He said the UAP challenge has for decades lent itself to mystery, sensationalism, and yes, even conspiracy. Yeah, I think that's a great rhetorical device that he's using to invalidate even looking at the UFO subject as a cover-up or conspiracy, which anyone who has looked at this with even a reasonable amount of time, it's very difficult not to conclude that there's a cover-up or indeed a conspiracy relating to UFOs. I've been talking about this way for 25 years. I'm not alone. Many people before and at the same time as me have been saying the same argument, and it's a good argument. But no, he's really just pushing that aside. Conspiracy, we're not dealing with conspiracies here. And sensationalism, like what? Crash retrievals of UFOs, the kinds of stuff that was practically stated openly in the New York Times just a couple of years ago when Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal essentially came to within a hair's breadth of essentially acknowledging that in an article in July 2020 in connection with an interview they did with Lou Elizondo. So is that sensationalism or allegations of alien bodies, which we've been having these detailed testimonies for decades and decades? We don't want to go there either. So, okay, you can really see there's this very significant attempt to just push away a tremendous amount of the, like 99% of the UFO subject, so that it can be analyzed in exactly the way, in the form of data that they demand. He kept talking about things like high integrity analysis to that effect. But really, contrast the reality of UFOs with what he is saying here. And I'm going to get into some of the reality of the UFO subject in just a moment. So that was essentially his prologue. And then there came some questions from the very, very small committee. How many, Senator Gillibrand asks him, how many UAP have you guys studied now? And he gives the answer of 650 cases studied so far. So that's about another 200 plus more than what we had heard about a year ago. You can really see that they're building in more and more cases. So that's good. 650 cases is not trivial at this point. Where they're going with that is a whole other question. He did say a couple of interesting things here that I felt were at least noteworthy. He said, look, his team is broken into two fundamental groups of analysts. He said, you have the scientists and engineers on the one side, and then you have the intelligence people on the other, basically red team and blue team. You give each of them the data, have them come up with their conclusions. Those conclusions then get adjudicated, as he put it. That then gets written up, and it goes, now this is interesting. It goes, he said, to a senior technical advisory group. Who are these people? They're outside of all of the AARO program. I kept wondering, who are they? And when you're hearing Kirkpatrick talk about this, you really could see he was very fuzzy on who these people were. But it goes to them. They're like retired intelligence people, retired DOD personnel, like the wise men or the wise men and wise women in the intel military complex. And they look this over, and they apparently are very important. We don't know anything else about them, but they make their own recommendations based on what the AARO office gives them. And then Kirkpatrick said he would then make his own determination and sign off one way or the other on the case, whatever that means. He also indicated that the AARO program has a classified web portal that is available to the right people. That doesn't include you or me, certainly not me, but if you've got classified clearances, then you can have access, in theory, to the web portal of that program. He also made a very interesting statement about those 650 cases, in which he said about half of the cases they've looked at have anomalous, interesting value. So maybe roughly 300, a little more than 300 cases. He did make a point in downplaying the ability to get a lot of data from a large number of those cases. He did say that they plan to do various types of statistical analyses of the reports to find commonalities and patterns, all of which would be an interesting and useful thing to do, no question. Then we come back to Senator Judy Ernst, who really kept asking about Chinese or Russian technology, and how does their technology connect to the UAP as a potential threat to U.S. national security. She hit this point quite consistently, and Kirkpatrick just said, he had a few interesting things to say here. He said, I think it is prudent to say that of the cases showing some sort of enhanced technical signature, as he put it, and he said there was very few of them. He did say, let me pull this up. He said, I am concerned about what that nexus, he's talking about the Russians and Chinese, what that nexus is. And I have indicators that some are related to foreign capabilities. He goes on and says, we have to investigate what our intelligence community partners, investigate that with them. And as we get evidence to support, that gets handed off to the appropriate IC agency to investigate. And Senator Ernst really, she kept coming back, like, could these be Russian or Chinese? And Kirkpatrick just said that there are some technologies on which the Chinese, especially the Chinese, are either on par or ahead of the United States. And then he makes this statement here. I'll pull this up. This I thought was very interesting. He said, the adversary is not waiting. They are advancing, and they are advancing quickly. They are less risk averse to technological advancement than we are. I thought that was really interesting on a number of levels. First of all, it's sounding the alarm. So giving that sense of urgency, like we need to get on our game and start developing technology as well as they are. And by them being less risk averse, it's like they're really less civilized than we are over here. We are careful. We are very risk averse. We are responsible, not like those people. They are not responsible. They are really not civilized as we are. I think really that was the message. Are they really less risk averse in the United States? Go ask around the world about a lot of U.S. behaviors to other countries, particularly in places like the global South, or even allies that are off the record, and how risk averse is the United States. I think you would find some serious disagreements here. But anyway, back to UAP. Kirkpatrick was responsible enough to say that he didn't have evidence that the Russians or Chinese were behind this, but he had what he called concerning indicators. And that seemed to satisfy Senator Judy Ernst. I think she really liked to hear that. And then by the end of this whole thing, there was a question or two about flight safety or what measures can be taken to do that, to ensure flight safety with these UAP. Not a whole lot was said that was interesting there. By the end of this, UAP have essentially become conflated with Chinese balloons. And with questions like, how can we develop cost-effective measures for dealing with these adversarial platforms, which are things like balloons and things like that. You get a little bit of a questioning about whistleblower protection. Senator Gillibrand did come back at the end to remind Kirkpatrick that his office has to be prepared to be with DoD personnel who have UFO or UAP information to relay without risk of violating their NDAs. In fact, he did say that they have brought in nearly 24 witnesses so far. He did seem to hint, in my view anyway, that I don't think he was too happy with some of those witnesses. Just by gauging his answer, you can make your own determination there. But he did seem to hint that he wanted a system to prioritize these people a little bit better. So that made me think he wasn't totally happy with some of these whistleblowers. He didn't give any of their information about that. And the very last thing that I noticed of this that was noteworthy was Senator Gillibrand's statement that she felt it was a problem that during the last Chinese balloon episode, Balloongate, that it was a problem that the AARO office was not in the public spotlight during that. And she felt that they should have been. And again, so you've got this situation where UAP have been almost fully conflated with things like balloons and other conventional technology. And I think it was a very clear statement by Kirkpatrick as well that the AARO office is not trying, they're not doing a scientific study of UFOs. 50 plus years ago, there was the famous Condon Committee in the 1960s. That's what they were supposedly trying to do. That is not what the AARO office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, they're not trying to do that at all. Nothing of the sort. And this, in fact, Kirkpatrick himself says that. So what are they really doing? What was this hearing yesterday all about? I see a couple of purposes here. One, that's too soon. Sorry, I'll come back to that. Since we have been in the UAP era, since 2017, we have seen the Pentagon very deftly manage the public image of UFOs on a number of occasions when they've really had to, like very much like how it was done in times past. They're doing it now. So back, I mentioned the Condon Committee of the 1960s. During the 1990s, when the Roswell subject was really growing in public interest, again, there was a very good initiative by the Air Force and the Pentagon to deflate growing public interest at that time. Basically, the military jumps in, they'll do their own little scientific study, and they put the subject to sleep for another couple of decades. Essentially, that UFOs or UAP now are not extraordinary. They are normal things. So yeah, the Robertson panel of 1953 was very important. And I kept thinking about that in relation to this event from yesterday. That event, the Robertson panel, way back then, 70 years ago, was also in response to a very big buildup of UFO sightings at the time. And it was handled purely in the classified world. So the public did not know what the Robertson panel even was. There were a couple of leaked things about it, but there was not any real confirmation about it. It was not for many years that the public learned about that. So what the Robertson panel did, it was a CIA-sponsored scientific panel to, at least allegedly, look at the UFO evidence. And much of what they looked at, in fact, was outstanding UFO evidence. We'll talk about that. I've talked about that elsewhere. But the entire game was rigged of the Robertson panel. And we know this for a fact. There's been a lot of very good study of the workings of the panel. The point of the Robertson panel was to gain control over UFO reporting procedures within the military chain of command, and also ultimately to defang Project Blue Book, which up till then had been, during 1952, Blue Book was a pretty reasonably capable, reasonably serious UFO reporting, investigating group, only for that 1 year, 1952. But they had about 15 people, and they were working hard to study these UFO reports. As a result of the Robertson panel, Blue Book was essentially just completely cut down to nothing, and for the rest of its existence through the 1960s was simply a straight out debunking office. So that was the point of the Robertson panel. And the other point of the Robertson panel was to work with major media to debunk UFOs and make UFOs totally conventional. This actually is one of the recommendations, a key one, that the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. And in fact, on top of that, this, just as soon as that panel ended on January 20th, 1953, there is a letter from the head of the committee, H.P. Robertson himself, to a colleague about the conclusion of the panel. And this is what he says. He starts it off with a German accent. Und so, perhaps that'll take care of the Forteans for a while. The Forteans being basically UFO believers, followers of Charles Fort, who's one of the early pioneers of UFO reporting. This is what that was all about. So the one thing they are explicitly trying to do is debunk UFOs to the public, and that's really what you in this latest hearing. What else do I have here? So yeah, point number one, demystify and debunk UFOs. But there's another point to what this panel yesterday was all about. And I would say feed the military-industrial complex. I think was actually really quite just one more part of what this is about. We are definitely at a point in which the UFO subject has been effectively hijacked by the military-industrial complex to be just one more brick in the edifice of power and public money going to them. This is not, they are definitely not going into an area in which they are trying to convince the public that UFOs are alien. They're not doing that. I know a lot of people for a long time were saying this was precisely what the goal was. But like, I think there's been enough years now that we have to just look at reality for what it is. And what you're seeing is with these public hearings again and again, not just this year, but last year and even before that, you have all of the military Defense Department statements moving away from the fact that this is anything alien or even exotic. But what they are doing is they're going into an area in which they are increasingly trying to push this toward the Chinese and the Russians as being culpable for the phenomenon. And that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. So demystify, debunk UFOs as alien, but increasingly try to pin this on the Chinese and Russians. I see that as a dangerous game because ultimately it's really playing with fire internationally in terms of international relations. And we'll just have to see where that goes. I don't see that as a good sign at all. And there, I think, is one more thing happening here. And this is just a question. Is this a case of the Emperor Nero fiddling while Rome is burning? Is this intentional obfuscation of some sort or another? Let me explain that a little bit better. In other words, there is, in fact, a serious problem going on worldwide relating to UFOs. And you have to ask yourself, is this the best that the government is giving the people? And I would like to give you a glimpse of the real UFO or UAP problem, which is a problem in which people see things with a very non-scientific data gathering technique. It's a data gathering technique that the AARO office doesn't seem to think is valid. That is human eyeballs. people around the world have been seeing phenomena that is not readily explainable. I'm going to go over a couple of examples. These are recent examples. Just a few encounters. I've only got 3 here I'm going to show you, then we're going to call it a day. But this type of action goes on all the time. It's not just military, by the way. It's everyone and everywhere. It's been going on nonstop for decades and decades. And it also, it's not just military encounters, but yes, things like abductions, acquisition of exotic tech, and so forth. But let's just start with this one. So this is a March 21st, 2017 case from the Gulf of Mexico. You can see right here where it is. And this is of a massive UFO rising from the Gulf of Mexico and speeding away. I'm going to read the account here to you. Gentleman writes into the National UFO Reporting Center. I will just read this. He says, close to 7 p.m. on March 21st, 2017, just before dusk, myself and 4 of the crew members aboard our vessel saw a craft that appeared to be 5 times our 240-foot vessel in length. My line of sight was about a quarter of a mile from our vessel. There was a rig behind the craft, about a half of a mile. I used this to help gauge the size of the craft. Sighting was approximately 80 miles southeast of New Orleans, Louisiana. The scene lasted about 40 seconds. Notice how exact this man is. He says the craft rose up out of the water about 40 feet. No water was dripping from the craft. That's something you hear quite a bit, frankly. Within a split second, the craft disappeared at a 30-degree angle into the sky. Again, very exact description by this man. Speed appeared to be faster than the speed of a light turning on in a room. Within seconds, it had disappeared completely. I can say for sure that the craft was dark colored, oval in shape, and made no sound whatsoever. With as many rigs, too, there has to be more witnesses than just the 4 on our vessel. Peter Davenport, who runs the National UFO Reporting Center, spoke to this man and wrote, we spoke via telephone with this witness, and he seemed to us to be unusually sober-minded. We suspect that he is a very capable, very reliable witness. This is also a MUFON case and went to the National UFO Reporting Center. You can look it up. Go to their site. You can just check the date. Here's one from 2007, October, off the east coast of the United States. This is a U.S. Navy encounter. Let's get into the details here. This is a U.S. Navy ship 100 miles off the coast of southern Virginia. The man writes, during a routine weather observation at 10 p.m. aboard a naval vessel during flight operations, I witnessed an object to my east moving at an extreme speed and changing directions rapidly before disappearing. It was a white light about 4 times the size of a star. Imagine an airplane at night with its lights not blinking, but flying at 5,000 miles per hour. Moving at a 45-degree angle from east to west, it abruptly changed course and made a right angle turn and disappeared. He said, I am a meteorologist for the Navy and observe the sky on a nightly basis. I'd say he's probably a pretty good witness. I have never seen anything like this. It was not caught on our radar. It appeared to be about 5 to 7 miles away, but I suspect it was farther away from that. That's also National UFO Reporting Center. I've got one more case, but I'll just say, this is a case at AARO. Would they even look at something like this? You have a qualified Navy meteorologist who sees this. You've got to think he's qualified to see what he's looking at, but their radar didn't capture it. So this doesn't go into the pile. I don't know. Are they studying this case or not? It's really worth asking. I have no idea. I have one more case I'll just show you here. This is also from 2007, just 1 month after the last one I said to you. I mentioned this one's off the west coast, off Baja California, about midway down there, November 2007. And by the way, this is not far at all from where the Tic Tac UFO encounter occurred just 3 years earlier than this event. In fact, to the month. But here we are in 2007. I'll just go over this. This is another U.S. Navy, 350 nautical miles south of San Diego, 11:30 p.m. So again, it's at night. 2 sailors see a V-like large, bright yellowish formation. The writer says it was bright like stadium lights and had 7 round glowing things making up the formation. Just behind it were 2 tiny white lights, one behind the other, spaced far apart like a tail. It's very interesting. two large white glowing balls came toward the ship, and the first one made a hyper quick zigzag motion and then flew over the ship. I've got some drawings I'm going to show you in a moment of this. He said, I looked up and saw a gray ball that wasn't glowing, and then it was gone. He said the second white glowing ball did a check mark motion and disappeared to the right. This is really interesting. The bridge commander told me the next day, my radar and computers went down or froze at about 3:30 a.m. and had to be fixed by electricians. This one went to a website, UFOs Northwest, run by Bill Puckett, who does really good work over there. In fact, here's the drawing that was submitted. So you can just see this Navy sailors drawing the motion of these things. You can see the check mark in the center and so forth. That's what we've got here. So those are just some encounters that again, not all of them are even military. This is people around the world on a regular basis are encountering very extraordinary types of events going on, but many of them are military. And it's been going on forever and ever, including abductions, including, yes, the acquisition of exotic technology and bodies. Let's just say it. The testimony on all of that has been discussed for a long time. Much of it's right here on this channel, and many of my previous programs that I have done, as well as others. When you compare the tepid matter of discussion and the whole PR aspect of what was going on there clearly yesterday, it was a PR exercise. When you compare all of that at the hearing yesterday with what any researcher who has studied this subject knows is going on, you cannot help but be struck by the utter disparity of reality versus pure PR. And that's really what we are seeing here. I think we should all know never to expect genuine honesty to come from the bureaucracy of the military establishment. I'm not here to dunk on the individual members of the military. There's many excellent people within that. But when we're talking about the bureaucracy of this structure of power, no, there is no honesty that comes out of there. And we should not be surprised that they play the same game with UFOs as with everything else that they do. And in fact, I would say UFOs remain a genuinely explosive subject. Explosive if you're being honest about it, which is why they can never be honest about it. Something very big and very important is going on in this world and has been going on for quite a long time now. And frankly, it's just too much for them to handle honestly. You can even argue on their behalf if you want that the public doesn't have a right to know, if you believe that, but let's at least be honest and call it for what it is, which is pure public relations management of the genuinely dangerous UFO subject. That's what we are seeing here. And that's all I've got for you. If you like this content, please do subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, turn on notifications. Also visit my website at Richard Dolan Members to see a lot more content just like this. So thanks again for your support. Catch you all again real soon. Later.